You are listening to A Royal Tragedy, a production of Baseball Will Break Your Heart. Researched, written, and narrated by me, Paul J. Atwood. Produced and scored by Joe Newman. Welcome to part 2 of A Royal Tragedy, presented by Baseball Will Break Your Heart. In chapter 2 of part 1, we covered the moment when Kansas City baseball suddenly mattered again, the acquisition of the greatest underdog squad since the Viet Cong, and the bullpen monster that changed the game. In the first chapter of part 2, we're going to tell you about possibly the dumbest midseason collapse in the history of the game, and the Royals' long-awaited but seemingly disastrous return to the postseason. Please enjoy the continuation of A Royal Tragedy. Part 2. The Wild Card Game. Despite coming off their first winning season in a decade, no one expected much from the Royals. In 2013, only the mooniest of fans held any hope that they would find a way into the wild card spot. To anyone that still cared about the Royals, it was a felicitous occasion, like seeing your knucklehead son go from eating glue sticks and getting crayons stuck up his nose to getting straight C's. It wasn't impressive, but it was a marked improvement. To everyone else in Kansas City, the end of the baseball season was a signal to continue their winter tradition of spending Sundays watching grown men give themselves brain damage on live TV. Winter, for baseball fans, can be an equally mind-numbing slog. It starts off trying to check some scores that aren't there, then daydreaming about free agency signings that never happen, then binge-watching Ken Burns' baseball, then considering starting a podcast with your friends. Then struggling to be interested in the NFL season just to have something to talk about around the water cooler. And then after the last Super Bowl commercial airs, you start counting down the days until pitchers and catchers report to spring training and the earth rights itself again. The return to the baseball diamond triggers a season of hope, and fans can believe for a short while at least that this year, like all the years before, will be their year. The Royals' 2014 season began with 2 losses in Detroit. Luckily, there were still 160 games left to play. Even the most generous sports writers were reluctant to apply the dark horse moniker to the Royals. If anything, they were a mottled mule and no one was going to bet a wooden nickel on them. After a lackluster start, anyone who had been paying attention to the Royals had moved on to following big market teams with big names that put up big numbers. Since Babe Ruth, all fans, players, owners, and writers cared about was the long ball and the rippling mutants that knew how to smash them. In 2014, baseball was no longer about what the Royals had to offer: speed, defense, contact hitting, and strong relief pitching. The fans filling the stadiums came of age watching lab-grown monsters like Sosa, McGwire, Canseco, and Bonds hit baseballs into neighboring time zones. Watching the Royals score on a rare leadoff walk followed by 2 groundouts and a pass ball was not the same as seeing Mike Trout bounce a big sexy dong off of Angel Stadium's fake boulders in center field. The 2014 Royals style of baseball harkened back to the teams that played in the dead ball era when players like Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner defined the game. They were also reminiscent of the few modern championship teams that played a smaller defense-first game like the Orioles of the late 60s and early 70s. Which were anchored by the effortless brilliance of Brooks Robinson and the 1980s Cardinals, led by the wizardly Ozzie Smith. By the 2000s, defense was for the birds. Home runs put butts in seats and produced reliable outcomes. Small ball involves more moving pieces and is more difficult to predict outcomes. But the Royals were a renaissance team that embraced the chaos and were capable of stringing together 9-inning masterpieces that would literally take your breath away. There was never a shortage of moments worthy of celebration as they chipped away at competitors, resurrecting and redefining the art of small ball baseball. In June of 2014, the Royals went on a 10-game tear and took first place in the American League Central for the first time since 2003. However, in typical Royals fashion, they fell into a mid-season slump. It looked like it was going to be another sagging, piss-soaked mattress of a season where the Royals would start strong, then deteriorate to the level of dumb beasts dragging their knuckles around to such a degree that the grounds crew no longer had to rake the infield. Then, at the last possible moment, play so well you suspected it had been a classless ruse. From June 19th to July 20th, they lost 17 of 26 contests. The crown was slipping out of reach, and fans that had seen this 29 times before started checking Cardinals scores. Out of concern for public safety, city officials, hoping to avoid another summer like 2005, posted the numbers for suicide hotlines along the major bridges that straddled the Missouri River. However, it wasn't injuries or poor leadership or the dreaded yips that were causing the Royals to tank. It was Clash of Clans. I wish it would have been any number of other factors, like Moose had contracted lycanthropy after being bit by a dog in Kansas City, Kansas, and the team was too preoccupied trying to cover up the fact that he ate a fan in Westport on the last full moon. Or that Alex Gordon's wife was trying to leave him for Eric Hosmer because Gordon liked to keep the house at a balmy 80 degrees year-round. But no. It was the iPhone version of World of Warcraft that nearly dragged the Royals back into the catacombs of obscurity and irrelevance. Like Nero, the Royals fiddled as their season was burning. They were swept by Boston following the All-Star break, and the team was 48-49 and had dropped into third place in the American League Central. After the final game of the sweep, first base coach Rusty Kuntz walked into the clubhouse and saw not a room full of World Series contenders, but a bunch of loafers fixated on their iPads jawing back and forth about the acquisition of imaginary goods, raids, and goblins. He noticed that the fervor with which they discussed this nonsense had a greater urgency to it than their disappointing on-field performance. The Royals should be very grateful this information was not leaked as it was happening. If this information had got out, there was the possibility of a very real raid perpetuated by fed-up fans fueled by 29 years of resentment and frustration. Kansas City was dangerously close to being the first team lost to an all-out fan rebellion. Kuntz, liking the fact that his head was attached to his shoulders and not posted somewhere as a warning, addressed the team.
What's the priority here?
He asked the players.
Is this just 3 hours out of your time spent away from what you're actually being interested in? We've got to find a way to get this changed.
Veteran leaders Raul Ibanez and James Shields organized a players' meeting where they addressed the issue and called upon the team to renew their commitment to the game. The 42-year-old Ibanez may have saved their season with a rousing address, a talent he had become known for over his long career. He said, "I just gave my honest observations and told them about the potential and talent they had. The talent here is so incredible. They just need to believe that. So I told them that, looking in from the outside, every team hated to play them. Everyone saw the talent they had. This was their opportunity. They were on the cusp of greatness. I just thought they needed a belief." That was the only players' meeting needed that season. They won 16 of their next 19. The fans were happy and no one's head was being used as a medieval PSA. Things were looking up. Please excuse the interruption. If you want to hear this entire 90-minute program without any interruptions, head over to Baseball Will Break Your Heart's Patreon and get it for free when you subscribe for just $5 a month. There you will have access to exclusive content and conversations about baseball history. And you can listen to miniature versions of features like this that explore baseball history and heartbreaks every month. Now, back to the show. From July 22nd onward, they were the best team in baseball, going 41-23. Like Ned Yost had said,
"The things we're good at are not statable."
the new age stat fanatics that now dominate conversations about the game are probably going to push their glasses up and say,
"Well, actually..."
while every woman within earshot contemplates a life less annoying. But the regular fan of the game didn't see a stat line when they saw this team. They saw a misfit band from a city no one cares about, led by a man baseball dismissed, making a legitimate run at the playoffs for the first time in a generation. It was exciting to see. They were a team of underdogs in an underdog franchise in an underdog city so insignificant no one knows what state it's in. But they began to believe they were a great team, and then they played like it. StatHounds can calculate a player's wins above replacement and adjust for context and apply their Pythagorean theorem, while their girlfriends reinstall whatever dating app they regret meeting them on. But down the stretch, the Royals played with an unstatable amount of heart and hustle. They got the ball in play. They rarely walked or struck out. They stole bases maybe when they shouldn't have. They chased down fly balls into the stands. They lived for the grind and would do whatever it takes to win. Call it Ned Yost devil magic or call it whatever you want, but the Kansas City Royals played like revenants that had turned their backs on the pearly gates and flipped St. Peter the Bird on their way back to Earth to claim even greater glory on the baseball diamond. After a season of dramatic ups and downs, on September 26th, the Royals clinched their first postseason berth since 1985. And in the final game of the season, they clinched home field advantage to host the first ever wild card game to be played in Kansas City. For fans, it was a bit disorienting because nobody born after 1980 really had any recollection of the Royals' last playoff win. It was an entire city that had been stuck on the same level of the same video game and now after almost 30 years finally figured out how to clear it. These were uncharted waters, and monsters be damned, Kansas City was just happy to be swimming in them. No matter where you went, it was, "How about those Royals?" Tickets sold out immediately. Fathers had grown old waiting to take their sons and daughters to see a playoff game at Kauffman Stadium. Now they could take their grandchildren. Even though the wild card game is essentially the opening act for the postseason, Royals fans showed up like it was Game 7 of the World Series. For a team and city suffering such a long playoff drought, it might as well have been. It was do or die, win or go home. Nothing was certain, nothing was given, and it was win or take all. The Royals would face the Oakland Athletics, who had started the season the best team in baseball and had to scramble to secure the last wildcard spot on the last day of the season. The A's selected all-star left-hander Jon Lester to take the mound. Lester was acquired by the Athletics at the trade deadline in hopes of making a championship run. He helped lead the Red Sox to World Series victories in 2007 and 2013. Lester also had a history with the Royals. In 2008, he was only the second pitcher to throw a no-hitter against Kansas City. The Royals predictably went with James Shields, whom they signed especially for games like this. Shields had a more than decent season, winning 14 games for the Royals. Though he was nicknamed Big Game James, his postseason record reflected otherwise. In 9 postseason starts, he only recorded 3 wins. He did have one big game in the 2008 World Series when he was largely responsible for Tampa's lone victory, but that is all that is outwardly remarkable about his big game career. It was time to live up to that nickname. The game started on the last day of September, but fans wouldn't leave until it was October. It would go down in the long and storied history of baseball as one of the greatest games ever played. It was an epic battle for the soul of the city. The A's were heavily favored. Lester was 4-0 against the Royals in 2014, but no one in attendance cared. They just came to cheer for their team. The roar of the crowd was the first thing mentioned by TBS sportscaster Ernie Johnson. At times during the broadcast, the announcers would have to raise their voices over the crowd chanting the familiar, This chant would become the defining feature of the Royals' playoff run. The energy emanating from the stadium could be felt all over the city. I've seen the Festival of Lights at Varanasi. I've seen the millions of swirling pilgrims circle the Kaaba in Mecca. I've seen the carnality of Carnival, the equinox at Stonehenge, and the Texas State Fair. But I've never seen anything that compares to the 40,000 faithful at Kauffman Stadium that night. For 5 hours in Kansas City, the air was charged enough to make your hair stand on end like a thunderstorm was rolling in, or God himself was there watching above the giant crown-shaped scoreboard. There has never been a body of faith and fervor quite like it. Before James Shields could throw out the first pitch, the crowd was chanting at full volume. The first pitch to Covelli Coco Crisp was in for a strike and the fans erupted. The greatest game of baseball to be played in the 21st century was underway. The Royals came into the game with the most stolen bases in baseball, but also the lowest number of home runs, strikeouts, and walks. Their approach was to get on base and make Lester regret not throwing a perfect game by creating chaos on the base paths. With speed being their key attribute, any Royal, with the logical exclusion of guys nicknamed Country Breakfast and Moose, could be a danger between the bags, and they were. The Royals took an early lead and the game seemed well in hand, but their threat of fate began to fray as the Royals lost control of the game in the 6th inning. Yost pulled Shields after he had thrown only 88 pitches and replaced him with starter Yordano Ventura, who was not familiar with the reliever's role. The decision to pull Shields, who was acquired for these types of games, was perplexing to fans. In 68 starts with the Royals, Shields had never thrown less than 90 pitches until that night. To replace him with Yordano Ventura on one day's rest after throwing 73 pitches on Sunday, to make only his second relief appearance, was to say the least difficult to understand. It was classic Yost, and it was no wonder Milwaukee got fed up with him. Ventura promptly gave up 5 runs, including a multi-run home run by Brandon Moss, his second of the game, making it 7-3 Oakland. The stadium was silent as fans contemplated storming the front office and demanding Yost's immediate resignation. According to statisticians, at the top of the 7th, the Royals only had a 3% chance of winning the game. The cameras were no longer pointed at the Royals dugout or their fans. Ernie Johnson called attention to the dour mood in the stadium by pointing out that Chiefs fans set a noise record at Arrowhead the night before and said in order to match that,
"It's going to take a real uprising tonight."
Fans affixed their rally caps as the Royals prepared to mount one of the greatest uprisings in playoff history. That's this week's show. Will the boys in blue bounce back to beat the brutes from the Bay? Tune in next week for the continuation of A Royal Tragedy, presented by Baseball Will Break Your Heart. A Royal Tragedy has been a production of Baseball Will Break Your Heart. Researched, written, and narrated by me, Paul J. Atwood, and scored and produced by the talented Joe Newman. Baseball Will Break Your Heart is a 2-man operation, and we need your help growing the show. So please rate and review. Tap 5 stars and say whatever you want. If you hate it, that's fine. Hit 5 stars and tell us all about it. If you hate me and you want to point out everything I got wrong, that's great. Give us a 5-star rating and just unload in the review. Not only does that help grow the show, it makes the review section fun to read, and we're here to have fun. Even if it is at my own expense. Most importantly, tell your friends and family about us. Your exes and secret crushes, even strangers on the street or the person stuck next to you in traffic. Just look them square in the face and tell them, baseball will break your heart. They'll know what you're talking about. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for the continuation of A Royal Tragedy, presented by Baseball Will Break Your Heart.